My name is Maya, and I work the graveyard shift at a small, nearly forgotten gas station on the outskirts of town. It's situated right next to a stretch of road where the cars hardly ever slow down, unless they're stopping for gas or a bathroom break. The place is basic: flickering fluorescent lights, cracked linoleum floors, and the faint smell of stale coffee in the air. Most of the people who stop by are travelers, some lost, others just taking a quick pit stop before getting back on the road. I don't mind it though. The routine is simple, and while it can be a bit lonely, it's predictable. The few regulars that come in, like the truckers and the old man who buys the same bag of peanuts every night, keep things comfortable. No surprises. I work alone during my shifts. It's quiet, especially late at night, and the occasional car that pulls into the lot is usually the most exciting thing that happens all night. But tonight, something felt different. It was a Tuesday, after midnight, and the hum of the gas pumps was the only noise filling the silence. That's when he walked in. At first, he was hard to miss. Tall, almost too tall, with a jacket that looked far too expensive for the setting. He wasn't young, maybe in his mid-40s, but there was something oddly timeless about him, like he belonged to another world. His hair was neatly combed back, and he had this quiet, intense air about him, like someone who was used to being the center of attention, though he didn't demand it. As he approached the counter, I noticed he was carrying a briefcase, the kind you'd expect someone to use in an office meeting, not at a gas station at 1 a.m. I greeted him, like I did everyone, and asked if he needed any help. His eyes met mine for a moment too long, as though sizing me up, before he spoke. "Just a coffee," he said smoothly, as though it were the most natural request in the world. His voice was calm but commanding, like someone who had perfected the art of conversation. I made his coffee, black, no sugar, no cream. He watched me as I worked, not saying a word. Once I handed him his coffee, he took a long sip and, as if the silence had been carefully crafted, he asked me, "Do you like it here?" It was such an odd question, especially at this hour, but I didn't think much of it. I smiled, told him that it was fine, and joked about how it was peaceful at night. His response wasn't what I expected. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing just a little, as if he were trying to gauge something deeper in my answer. "Is this really what you want to do with your life?" he asked, his tone soft but probing. It wasn't a normal question, but again, it wasn't overly creepy, just strange. I laughed lightly, trying to brush it off. "I'm happy enough," I said, hoping to end the conversation, but the man didn't let it drop. He seemed almost disappointed by my answer, his lips pressing into a thin line as he set the coffee cup down. "You're wasted here," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You have potential. You could be doing so much more." I couldn't help but feel a strange chill at his words. Something in his tone wasn't right, but I smiled again, trying to keep things light. I busied myself with cleaning the counter, hoping he'd get the hint that I wasn't interested in continuing this weird exchange. But just as I thought he would leave, he asked me, "What time do you finish your shift?" I wasn't sure how to respond, so I gave him a vague answer, hoping he'd let it go. But he didn't. He just smiled, that same smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and nodded. "Interesting," he murmured, and then, before I could even register what was happening, he placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter. "For your time," he added, like it was nothing. Then, without another word, he turned and left, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had come. I didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't a typical encounter, but it didn't feel threatening either, just off. I tried to shake it off, but the whole thing stuck with me. A week later, he came back. This time, there was a woman with him. She had a bright, almost too bright smile that didn't quite fit the atmosphere. She looked to be in her early 30s, with platinum blonde hair and an expensive-looking dress that clung to her like she was trying to make a statement. She had this strange air about her, like she was used to getting whatever she wanted. The man didn't speak, as usual, but the woman was another story. She turned to me with that same overly cheerful expression and said, "You're beautiful." It wasn't a compliment I'd received often at the gas station, and something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't genuine, it was too rehearsed. Then, she leaned in, just slightly, and placed her hand on my arm. "Have you ever thought about doing something more?" she asked, her voice low and sweet, like she was letting me in on a secret. My heart skipped a beat. The words were too familiar. The same line the man had used the first time. She kept talking, though, her voice smooth as silk as she told me about an exclusive opportunity. It was vague, but she made it sound like I'd be foolish to turn it down. The number she threw out, $20,000 for a weekend, sounded ridiculous. She said that people like me could make that kind of money, and all I had to do was join them for a special event. It was clear now that something was very wrong, but I kept my cool, trying to play it off. But then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Come outside for a second. There's someone who can explain everything better." No, I wasn't going anywhere with them. I didn't even hesitate. I told her I was busy, that I had work to do, and I turned away. She didn't push, but her smile faltered just for a second, and I could see the frustration flash in her eyes. Without another word, she grabbed the man by the arm and they left. I could hardly breathe, and I immediately texted my boss. I told him what had happened, and he told me to keep an eye out. The whole thing felt wrong. The next week, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was familiar. It was the same model, the same color, the car they had driven before. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart raced as I walked to my car, trying to look casual, but every part of me screamed that I was being watched. As I got in, I saw the car in my rearview mirror, moving slowly behind me. My heart pounded. They were following me. I didn't panic, but I didn't know what to do. Every turn I made, they made. I drove in circles, trying to lose them, but they were always there, just behind me. I was about to pull into the nearest gas station when I realized I couldn't shake them. Without thinking, I sped toward the nearby police station. As soon as I pulled into the lot, the car peeled off, speeding away without another glance. My body shook with adrenaline. That night, I told my boss, and we reviewed the security footage together. The footage was worse than I thought. The cameras had caught two figures in the shadows near the entrance, waiting for me to leave. They had planned it. But what chilled me the most was the discovery that the car's license plate was stolen. I haven't seen them since, but I'll never forget how close I came to being caught in their web. I still work the night shifts, but I'm always looking over my shoulder now, wondering if they'll come back. And every time I lock the doors, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching. I work the night shift at a small, 24-hour convenience store located off a long, desolate highway. It's the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. A small, worn building with flickering lights and cracked windows. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs the only constant noise during the dead of night. It's usually pretty quiet, just me restocking shelves or zoning out at the counter, keeping an eye on the few customers that wander in for a late-night snack or a quick fill-up. But after what happened to me, I don't think I'll ever work a night shift again. The store's not exactly busy at 2 a.m., but it's enough for me to stay alert. Most of the time, the customers are either truckers stopping for coffee or college kids grabbing chips and soda before heading back to their dorms. I've gotten used to it, but that night, that was different. It was a particularly slow night, nothing unusual. I was working behind the counter, mindlessly sorting through a stack of receipts when I noticed him. He didn't immediately stand out. Just a guy in his mid-30s, wearing a faded hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low. He wandered in as if he were looking for something, but wasn't really sure what. At first, I figured he was just another late-night shopper. But then something about the way he moved caught my attention. He didn't pick anything up. He didn't seem to have any real purpose. He kept walking the aisles in a slow, deliberate pace, never getting too close to anything, just lingering in the corners of my vision. Every time I looked up, he was still there, in a different part of the store, always watching, but never approaching. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just lost in thought. Maybe he was looking for something specific. But the more I noticed him, the more my stomach churned. It was like he was following me. Not directly, but always close enough that I could feel his presence. It was like he knew exactly where I was at all times, and I wasn't sure if it was intentional or if I was just paranoid. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, waiting for something. I decided to ignore him and kept my head down, hoping he would just leave. But then the store door opened, and another person stepped inside. A woman. She was wearing a bright red jacket, far too bold for the hour, with long, black hair and a sharp gaze. I didn't recognize her. She walked straight toward me, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor with an unnerving precision. She smiled, but it was off, like she wasn't smiling out of politeness, but out of something else, something I couldn't place. "Hi," she said, her voice too sweet. "You're working late, huh?" I gave her a polite nod, not sure where this conversation was going. It wasn't unusual for people to talk to the lone worker late at night. They usually just wanted to pass the time. But then she leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "That guy over there," she said, motioning subtly toward the man in the hoodie, who was now standing a few aisles away, facing a shelf but clearly aware of our conversation. "He's been following you around, hasn't he?" My blood ran cold. I hadn't said anything about him to anyone. How could she know? I glanced at the man, but when I looked back, the woman was already gone. I blinked, confused, and by the time I processed what had just happened, she had disappeared into the aisles. I stood there, frozen for a moment, my mind racing. I was tempted to approach the man, maybe ask if he needed help with something, but something told me that wasn't a good idea. Instead, I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the fact that it was the dead of night and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the minutes passed, I noticed something unsettling. The man wasn't shopping. He was just standing there, watching me. It was subtle, but his gaze never left me. The more I stared at him, the more it felt like he was waiting for something. Maybe he wasn't just a random customer. Maybe he was waiting for me to do something, to make a move. And in that moment, I realized he had been doing this for much longer than I had noticed. I told myself I needed to stay calm. I was alone, but I had a phone, and the store had security cameras. But just as I grabbed my phone to call the manager, the power flickered. It was brief, but it was enough to make me pause. The lights flickered twice before going out completely, leaving me standing in near darkness. I heard the man move, the sound of his shoes tapping on the floor, slow and deliberate. I could hear him getting closer, and in that instant, I realized I wasn't alone in the store anymore. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter, trying to keep my breathing steady. I couldn't see anything through the darkness except for vague shapes and shadows. I cursed under my breath, trying to figure out what to do. The man was too close now, and then the door opened. I barely heard it, just a soft creak, but it was enough to make me freeze. There was a figure standing in the doorway. Another person, a man, tall and bulky, wearing a mask. I couldn't see his face, but his presence was enough to make my blood run cold. The man in the hoodie stepped into view. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was standing next to the masked man, his face devoid of any emotion. The two of them didn't speak. They didn't need to. They both knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't waste a second. I ran for the back door, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. As I pushed through the door, I heard one of them call out, but I didn't turn around to see who it was. My heart was pounding in my ears. I ran as fast as I could, my breath ragged, until I reached the front of the store and found my coworker, who had already dialed security. When the police arrived, the store was empty. The men were gone. They searched the entire place and reviewed the footage. They found nothing. No sign of the masked man, no trace of the woman who had warned me. It was like they had never been there at all. But the cameras caught something else. A few frames showed the man in the hoodie, standing still as he stared into the lens. In the very last frame, a faint figure appeared behind him, blurred, like someone had been standing in the shadows just out of view. I've never been able to shake the feeling that I was the target, and every time I walk into that convenience store, I look over my shoulder, waiting for someone to appear out of nowhere. I used to work at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzes late into the night and the coffee always tastes a little burnt. I used to love it, the quiet, the simplicity. After the late-night rush from the bars and the truckers who stopped for breakfast, it was just me, alone in the quiet hours. But after what happened one night, I don't think I'll ever work a night shift again. It was just past 3 a.m., and the diner was empty, save for the usual late-night customer. A guy who always ordered the same thing, a coffee and a slice of pie before he'd head out. It was calm, so calm that I started to feel the weight of the quiet pressing in. I found myself cleaning the counter, wiping down the menus, and just trying to pass the time. I stepped outside for a breath of air and to stretch my legs. The parking lot was empty, and the only noise was the low hum of the highway traffic in the distance. I stood under the flickering neon sign, watching my breath form little clouds in the cold air. I wasn't out there long before I noticed a figure walking down the empty road, too far off to make out details, but something about the way he moved caught my attention. He wasn't walking fast, but his steps were deliberate, almost like he was pacing the sidewalk without a real destination. He didn't seem like someone just out for a late-night stroll, especially considering the area. He walked past the diner, then stopped. I figured he was just someone passing through. But then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned and started walking back toward me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something in the way he moved. He wasn't just walking anymore. He was coming toward the diner. As soon as I saw that, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and trying to act casual. I didn't want to seem paranoid. The bell above the door chimed as he walked in. He was tall, thin, with a dark jacket that looked like it was made for colder weather. His face was pale, but his eyes were too dark, like there was something buried deep in them. He made no attempt to greet me. He just walked in and sat at one of the booths in the corner, his back to the wall, eyes scanning the diner. It felt strange, his quietness, but I brushed it off. People came in all the time at odd hours. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was looking for some warmth. I didn't approach him right away. I went back to wiping down the counter, trying to stay busy. But then I noticed he was watching me again. Not just looking, but studying me, like I was some kind of puzzle he was trying to figure out. I finally forced myself to go over. "Can I get you something?" I asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. He smiled then, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was thin, almost sadistic, and it made the pit of my stomach tighten. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, almost like he was deciding whether or not I was worth his time. Finally, he spoke in a low voice, just above a whisper. "I'm just waiting for someone," he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "I hope you don't mind." I forced a smile. "Not at all," I said, though I felt the unease crawl up my spine. His eyes never left mine, and it was like he was challenging me to say something more. But I kept my cool, went back to the counter, and pretended to be busy. The minutes ticked by. I glanced at him from time to time, and he never moved, just sat there, his eyes fixed on the door, like he was expecting someone. At one point, I caught him glancing at the clock on the wall. 3:30 a.m. I thought I saw him smirk to himself, like he was enjoying something I couldn't see. Just as I started to feel the tension grow unbearable, the bell above the door chimed again. A woman walked in. She looked normal enough, but she was dressed in all black, clothes that didn't quite fit the vibe of the diner. She didn't look at me. Her gaze went straight to the man in the corner booth. She walked straight toward him without a word, sitting down across from him as if they'd been meeting for hours. I froze. Something wasn't right. I watched as the two of them exchanged no words, only silent gestures that seemed to communicate something I couldn't understand. Then, in a quick motion, the man stood up, glanced over his shoulder at me, and walked past, his face expressionless. I turned my attention back to the woman, who hadn't even noticed me at this point. She was busy staring at her hands, like she was waiting for something. It was then that I noticed the way she was holding her bag. She gripped it too tightly, like she was hiding something. I felt a surge of curiosity, mixed with that same unease. I debated asking her if she needed anything, but I didn't. She didn't seem like the type who wanted to be disturbed. I glanced at the clock. 4 a.m. Suddenly, the woman stood up, adjusted her bag, and walked toward the door. As she passed, I caught a glimpse of something, a flash of something shiny in her bag, like a glint of metal. My heart skipped a beat. It looked like a knife. She didn't say a word as she left, and I watched her walk into the night. I stood frozen for a few moments, my body rigid with tension. Something was wrong. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to do something or not, but all I knew was that I had to leave. I grabbed my phone, and just as I was about to call the police, the The man from the booth walked back in. This time, he didn't even glance at me. He headed straight to the kitchen door, his movements precise, controlled. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should call for help or run. But before I could act, the man turned and looked at me. That same knowing smile spread across his face again. "Thanks for the company," he said, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. I froze as he turned, the doors swinging behind him. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat, my hand trembling as I dialed 911. When the police arrived, the place was empty. The woman was gone, and the man had disappeared. There was no sign of them anywhere. They searched the area, checked the parking lot, but they didn't find anything. The woman's bag was left behind in the corner booth, still clutched tight. It had been stuffed with money, hundreds and thousands. But there was nothing else. No identification, no trace of who they were or what they wanted. I've never felt so exposed in my life. I haven't worked a night shift since that night. Something about the way they looked at me, like I was a piece of the puzzle they were putting together, still haunts me. I don't know what their plans were, but I can't shake the feeling that it could have ended much worse. If you felt the chill creeping up your spine and the unease gnawing at the edge of your mind, you're not alone. These stories are just the beginning. Darkness lurks around every corner, waiting to pull you deeper. Don't let the fear fade away. Subscribe now and keep the suspense alive. Every night brings a new tale, a new terror, and you won't want to miss what's lurking in the next chapter. The unknown is waiting. Are you brave enough to face it? Subscribe now.